Well, hey, good morning. It's good to be with you guys this morning. Welcome to 11 a.m. at Grace Church. My name is David Black. I'm the campus pastor here. And if you're guests visiting with us, good to have you here. Something we say and we fully mean is that as a people, we would rather pursue God together than to pretend that we have it all together. And what that means is that it's very easy for us sometimes just to come in and put a smile on our face and say, hey, life is good, when really life may not be good, or maybe it is good, but that's just kind of the thing that you say. And so we don't want to be that. We actually believe that God's at work in people. And so if you had a great week, we hope that you connect with somebody around the person and work of Jesus Christ. If you had a bad week, we would hope that you would connect with somebody around the person and work of Jesus Christ, because we think that Jesus is actually the best thing we could talk about and the best thing that we could share. And so we say, too, that you don't have to be a follower of Jesus to come here. And so if you're just checking him out and you're going, I don't know what I believe, I'm not sure, I was raised outside of the church, I was raised in the church, all of that's not really clear to me, we're glad that you would include us in on that discussion. And this is a part of the gathering, the service, where we open up God's heart, that's what we call this, and we see what his heart has to say about our heart. And whether you're a regular tender, you call Grace Church home, or whether you're just, as I said, visiting with us today, our hope is that as we open God's heart, he might open yours, and you might find out something about yourself that you did not know, and find out something about him and who he is that you did not know. And so we've been doing that in a second series this year. We started one in January, we're in our second one, and it's entitled, Jesus is Jesus. And we started that last week, and you were probably here. If you were here, you kind of know what this is about, but in case you weren't, you might be saying, well, of course Jesus is Jesus. Who else would he be? So for a quick review, last week I shared a picture with you that kind of got to the heart of this a little bit, and it's this symbol right here, Superman. Now you might be saying, oh, Jesus is Superman? Is that what we're saying? No. And what we talked about last week was this, that whether you grew up loving comics or not loving comics, this symbol probably means something to you. So maybe you think really strong person or person with laser vision. But depending on what era you grew up and what comic you read or what show you saw on TV, you have a different picture, perhaps, or different version of Superman in your mind. And maybe to you, Jesus just is Superman. Like, you just tend to think of him as like this generally all-powerful guy who's going to rescue you from whatever calamity is plaguing the earth right now, right? Whether that be killer bees or a giant meteor, right? He's going to take care of that. Or maybe you have the version of Jesus that was handed to you by your family or maybe by your church. And so we're just saying this, could we just, for a moment, what would happen if we actually took our version of Jesus and put it on the side and said, what would it look like to actually encounter the person of Jesus as we see him in the Bible? And so we basically said that this is important for one reason. It's not that as a pastor, I would be concerned that you would just flat out reject Jesus. I would care about that, but that's not my fear. My concern is that because we live in the Western culture with a lot of religious baggage and background, my concern is not that you would just flat out reject Jesus. I think the larger danger for us is that we would replace Jesus with a version that we like of our own. And so to do this, all we're doing throughout the entire series is looking at an account of Jesus' life found in the Gospel of John. The word gospel literally means the good news. And so John was a disciple of Jesus. He followed him around. He was part of his inner circle, and he wrote down what Jesus said and did. And we said last week, John was interesting because John uses the name Jesus 243 times, more than any other of the Gospels. He gives us face-to-face encounters with Jesus. And on top of this, John actually only gives us 21 days of Jesus' life. 21 days. He's very selective. And so we said, why is he being selective? And in fact, what is he doing? And the reason he's being selective is because he's trying to get us to ask this question. And that question is the question of the entire series, and that's this: is Jesus Jesus? He's like, hey guys, I wrote down a lot of stuff, but what I've written down is so that you might ask this question: is the Jesus of the Bible the Jesus of your heart and your life. Not your parents, not your pastors, not your churches, the real one. And so what we're doing is John actually wrote for this purpose. We looked at that last week. You can go back and take a listen. He actually recorded 7 different accounts, things that he calls signs. Some versions would say miracles. And we're just taking a look at each one and going, what can we see about Jesus? And we're going to spend some time face to face with him, leading all the way up to Easter. And so we said this last week, and I'll just say it again before we move on, that a sign, if you think about a sign is never there simply so that you stop at the sign. The sign, if you think about a sign, as we think about it, whether that be an exit sign in this room, or whether that be a sign on the highway, it's pointing to something. It's saying there's something beyond me that is important. It's calling attention to something. It's there for your guide. And so what we're going to do is not just look at the miracles and go, great, Jesus did some miracles. But we're actually going to try to get behind it a little bit and say what is and who is and what's happening here with Jesus. And so the first sign that we're taking a look at today, it's not the first sign in the book of John, but it is the one that we're covering, is this. It's the sign of sight. You say, sight? What do you mean? We're going to take a look at a rather lengthy chapter. Lengthy chapter does not always equal lengthy sermon, so just be honest there. But it's important that we read the whole thing. Because I think sometimes we can chop it up and miss the larger story of what's going on. And so I'm going to give you a quick background, and we're going to jump into this and go, what is it that we're supposed to see with Jesus here? Some quick background. What we're going to encounter in John, there's been one of the Jewish festivals that just happened. And so it would be like a holiday. It took 7 days. Everyone would stop for 7 days. I wish we would do that. They stopped for 7 days. At the end of the week, they would light these giant torches. And when I say giant, I mean giant, massive torches on stands. So think about putting up a Christmas tree and then lighting it on fire. You're like, that's my kind of holiday. It is, it's right. Like some of you have that holiday, and it happens sometime in January in Georgia after you throw out your Christmas tree. But they put it on these giant stands, and the whole temple, which was the center of Jewish life, would be filled with heat and light. Okay, no fire marshals back then. It was just completely like all night, these torches would burn, and then people would dance and party. That was the end. And so that just finished. And they've taken down those giant torches, and everyone's kind of dispersing from this week-long party of light where they were dancing and having fun and celebrating symbolically what this light meant to them as a people. So they're leaving that, and as they're leaving that, Jesus encounters someone, and this is where we pick up. And like I said, it's rather long, but I think it's worth our attention. So can I read it for us today? Is that all right? Can we read that? Here's what we're told happens. Speaking about Jesus. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the work of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, okay, so he said all this with the blind guy there. The blind man heard all this. Having said all these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Gross. Then he anointed the man's eyes with mud. That's a spiritual way of saying he smeared it on his eyes. And said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Like, don't miss that. This guy spit in the ground, mixed mud, put it on a blind guy's eyes. He washed it in water from birth, and now he sees. You're like, what's the rest of the chapter about, right? The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, it is he. Others said, no, but he's like him. In other words, doppelganger. He kept saying, I am the man. So they said to him, Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." And then they said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I don't know." They brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had been formerly blind. That's his name now, the man who is formerly known as blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath," speaking of Jesus. But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was a division among them, so that they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him, since he opened your eyes?" He said, "He's a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say," I love that, passive aggressive, "who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know. Nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He's of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." How we doing? Everybody all right? Good? Okay. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God." That's a fancy way of saying in a very strong tone, like we're serious. "We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again?" And I love this. "Do you also want to become his disciples?" I think he's just messing with them, right? And they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." Then the blind man answered, "Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born in utter sin," speaking about his illness. "And would you teach us?" And they cast him out. Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" That's an Old Testament title for the Messiah. "Do you believe that I'm the one who God sent, that I'm God in the flesh to save you and to redeem the world?" He answered, "Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, listen to how Jesus responds, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into the world, that those who do not see may see, and those who may see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard him say these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains." Thanks for your patience with that. I think it's important that we actively engage that sign together. There are about 900 sermons in that. 900. I'll give you the shortest one that I know how to give. Okay? This morning, I want to point out, we're going to take a look at three things in this text. We're going to take a look at the miracle and figure out what that has to say. We're going to take a look at a metaphor, and then we're going to take a look at this man, and then we're going to go home. Okay? Take a look at the miracle of blind eyes. I think it's interesting that the first person that we hear and we're told sees in this passage is not the blind man, it's actually Jesus. Jesus is leaving. Look, verse 1. Jesus is leaving, and what does Jesus do? Jesus saw a man born blind. Don't miss that. That the God of the universe in the flesh is leaving a festival about light, and he sees a man whose life is utter darkness. The disciples don't even see the man. You say, what do you mean? Well, they go, hey man, who sinned? Why is this guy like this? Is it his parents? In other words, is the reason that his life is messed up because of other people? Maybe you've heard that before. Or is the reason his life messed up because of something he did? Which one is it? By the way, those two philosophies still exist in our world. What's wrong with me is everybody else's fault. And what's wrong with me is all my fault. And Jesus looks and goes, neither, actually. But before we get there, don't miss the fact that the disciples didn't even see a guy. They saw a question, a philosophy question, an example to be discussed. And Jesus goes, no. There's a person here upon which I want to have compassion. I want to have compassion. Jesus goes, you're asking me, what's the issue with this guy? And I want you to know that there is actually compassion that is to be had on him. I wouldn't normally do this, but I just invite you to close your eyes for a minute if you could. This isn't one of those every head's bowed, every eye closed, no invitation thing. This is just me inviting you to close your eyes. And I realized inviting people to close their eyes in a sermon is very, very dangerous, okay? But close your eyes for a minute and imagine that this is your existence. Imagine that you've never seen your mother or father's face. Think about how isolating that would be. Think about how vulnerable and dependent you are. Blind people are easy to take advantage of because they could be led anywhere. Imagine that your entire life is dark, no color. You've never seen a tree, a sunset, or a sunrise. You've heard the weather to you is completely different. That's your existence. And Jesus goes, I see you. And Jesus takes the initiative and moves towards you. And now, while your eyes are still closed, you hear a man say that as long as I'm in the world, there's work for me to do. And then you hear him say, I'm the light of the world. What are you thinking? How does that feel? You can open your eyes if you'd like. Jesus looks at the man and says, you want to know what's up with this guy? It's not that he sinned. It's not that his parents sinned. Do you want to know what's going on? The way that God looks at the issues in this world, he's going, this is why I came. You want to know who's responsible for this? As far as like fixing it, I am. He's why I'm here, guys. So that God's work might be displayed. It's actually Jesus who sees the need of this man. You ever wonder, is God blind? You ever think about that? Forget the man. Is God blind to the blindness in this world? Is God blind to the darkness in this world? And Jesus goes, I see the need in his life. Xerox, this is one of the first Xerox machines ever tried to be sold. It's quite large, right? That's how it goes with technology. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right? They couldn't sell these because nobody wanted a machine this large in their office. And they had ad campaigns, and they had sales forces, and they'd make calls, and they'd do cold calls, and they'd go visit businesses and all these things. But they found out that no matter how hard they tried, Xerox had a problem. They couldn't sell machines until one day they hired a marketing campaign, and they said, look, you guys are looking at this all wrong. And they said, what? We make machines. And they said, we know you make machines, but you are not selling machines to people. It's not working. They said, okay, tell us what to do. And so they came up with an ad campaign that focused on copies. And they said, what you have to understand, and what we now know in advertising, is that companies don't need machines. They need copies, right? Jesus knows that what our world needs is not a debate about why we ended up this way. He goes, what we need is a Savior who can solve the issue of our deepest and darkest need. And he goes, that's me. And as long as I'm here, you guys can debate, but I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to do something about it. It's interesting, the Bible actually uses the word blind for the world that we see today. In fact, Isaiah 59 talks about it this way. Therefore, justice is far from us. We hope for light, and behold, darkness, and for brightness, but we walk in gloom. We grope for the wall like the blind. We grope like those who have no eyes. We stumble at noon as if it's in twilight. You see what he's saying? Saying spiritually, that's the world that we live in. And what's interesting is that the Bible also says that one day someone will come to eventually deal with all this. As it says in Isaiah 42, same book talking about this, says this, that one day there will be somebody who will come to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, and from the prison those who sit in darkness. If we're all to be honest, we're a little bit like these fish down in Mexico. These fish have adapted to their environment. They no longer have eyes. They're born blind because they live in caves under the ground. There's no need for it. It's dark. And so genetically, their DNA just turned off that part of their genome because they don't need it. In other words, there's no light coming in. They've pretty much just accepted, like their biology has just said, we're going to accept the environment that we're in. And that's honestly how oftentimes we feel. Right? You ever feel like that's just the world we live in, and that's the way it's going to be, and there's not really hope for it? You ever feel like, hey, yeah, okay, we might not be blind physically, but we've been born blind spiritually, and everything else that we look at, what are we going to do? And Jesus goes, listen, that's exactly why I came. I don't know the purpose of your pain as a pastor. I'm not going to sit here and tell you every cloud has a silver lining. I don't know the purpose for your pain. But what I do know is that your pain points to why Jesus came. Whatever that suffering is in your life and that darkness, maybe it's your own, maybe it's somebody else's. Maybe you're like, I've been asking that question since I've been around. I don't know. But what Jesus is saying, there is a God who knows about it and actually has done something and is doing something about it in Jesus Christ. In her book, Confronting Jesus, Rebecca McLaughlin puts it this way. She says, suffering is not an embarrassment to the Christian faith. It is the thread with which Christ's name is stitched into our lives. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying this man's not blind because he sinned. He's not blind because his parents sinned. This isn't a punishment. This is the world in which we live, and yet I am going to stitch the goodness and the glory of God into his life through this pain. I think if I was to sit here and ask you about times when you woke up and the lights were out or when you didn't have a flashlight, you might tell me all kinds of stories, comical stories, scary stories. You might be willing to show me some injuries that you got. You stub a toe in the darkness. You're like, it's never been right since I got up in the middle of the night. But what about when that's your soul? Because as a pastor, here's what I know to be true, that most of us bear injuries of life from trying to stumble about in the darkness. And yet, again, God, and specifically Jesus, came to deal with darkness. He's not scared by yours. He's not ignorant to it. He actually moves towards it to do something about it. And that's what he does with the man. The miraculous thing here is that we see in verse 7, he anointed the man's eyes with mud and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And then simply put, so he went and washed and came back seeing. That's incredible. He went and he washed and he came back saying. So some of you might be here and you're going, okay, that's great, but what about the mud? Like, couldn't he have just been like, see? Probably could have. Couldn't he have just been like, put his hands without the spit and mud on the guy's eyes? Why did he do that? Now, if you're asking that question, you should go to seminary because there's 100,000 books written about why they think that is, okay? There's 100 reasons. Some of them are great. Some of them are like, yeah, I think you just made that up. Let me just give you two which are somewhat plausible, and I think something like one which makes a little bit of sense to me and one that makes a little bit more sense, okay? The first one, some people say is, what's going on here is Jesus actually wants him to go, and a blind man actually is going to feel pain from stuff in his eyes, and he's going to need to wash it out. So he doesn't want him to not go, so he's going to put something in his eyes that kind of gives him a little push to go obey, right? And I think while that's irritating to him, in a moment I'll show you how that's actually more irritating to somebody else, which leads to the second one, which we're going to get to. See, Jesus is not, I don't think, just putting mud in his eyes to irritate his eyes. I think he's doing this because he's trying to not put mud in that guy's face. Jesus actually is trying to shove it in somebody else's face and irritate them. I kind of think Jesus is picking a little fight, to be honest. You say, well, how? Well, that leads us to the second thing. There's a metaphor, right? It's very obvious in this text. Because the first 7 verses are about a blind guy. The rest of the 41 verses that we read are all about people who can see. The neighbors can see. His parents can see. The religious leaders can see, right? Now the blind guy can see. But all those people who can see have an other issue. And that's about what? What's the metaphor? Blind hearts. Blind hearts. See, I think what he's getting at is actually there was something else going on in the religious leaders at that time that he's pushing on. And in the same way that the mud irritates that guy's eyes, we see that this actually, man, it really gets them angry. You see this in verse 14 and 16. It says, now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud. Okay. Why is that important? Think about this. John's not writing on a typewriter. He's not writing on a keyboard. He can't just hit the delete key. When he's writing something down, he's using time and precious space that they didn't have. Well, just go to the store and buy more copy paper. That's not how that worked. He's writing this and he's going, now it was the Sabbath. And if you were a Jewish person, you'd go, when he mixed the mud. You see, I think there's some picture here that you need to know about and what Jesus is doing. So the Jewish leaders had laws upon laws upon laws about what it meant to be a good follower of God. And they believed that if you were a good follower of God, you actually believed the words of God, which is true. It's a good thing. And you would actually honor God. That's also good. That you would fear God, meaning not scared of him, but like his voice mattered to you, and you structure your life around that. And all of that is true. But then they kind of went a step further, and they said, well, then how do we really know what all of God's words mean? And they began to add the words of man to the words of God. And as they heaped that on top of people in another portion of Scripture, Jesus said that became burdensome and a weight which people were not meant to bear. And so one of the things God said is that you are not to do anything one day a week, called the Sabbath. Thou shalt do nothing. And he's like, the reason I want you to do that in a 24/7 agricultural setting is that you need to know that you're not the sole person responsible for your life. I want you to do nothing. I want you to depend on me. I mean, that's a whole nother sermon. But the Jewish people said, well, what does that mean? And they began to make laws, and one of those laws is a law called losh or losh. And it's this one right here. It means all activities which, like kneading, join small particles into one mass using liquid and applies to both foods and non-foods. So you can't bake a cake on the Sabbath. You can't knead dough. You can't mix cement. Get what else you can't mix? Spit and mud. So Jesus spits into his hands and puts it on the guy's eyes, and they totally miss a miracle, and they go, he's a lawbreaker. He's a lawbreaker. And Jesus does this because he wants to show them that they have a problem, not with their eyes, but with their hearts. They're going, oh, they're so caught up in their own system for defining righteousness that they fail to see the author of the law standing in front of them, who just made this man's eyes work. That's incredible. Think about that. We see this in their argument over and over and over again. Like, look how backwards this is. His parents come up and they're like, how did this happen? They could say, Jesus, the Messiah, did it. But the one thing that they could not say was that, right? And so they don't say that. Why? Because the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. They were not interested in the truth. They were interested in their truth. And they're going, anything that doesn't conform to our truth, we don't want to hear it. All right? It goes further in the next portion. They have this guy who's a blind man going, guys, I already told you and you would not listen. How was he born blind? The guy called Jesus, he did it. No, that can't be. Tell us how. And he's like, I've told you this already, right? This is meant to be somewhat ironic and comical. You got a blind guy educating the most educated, enlightened people in his culture. It's just back and forth. We see that later on. He starts preaching to the preachers because they're like, in this next verse, hey, can't be that. And he goes, well, never since the beginning of the world has this ever happened. And he's like, this is clearly God. And they're like, you were born in utter sin, therefore you don't know what you're talking about. And he's like, yeah, but I was also born blind and now I can see. And they don't care at all. You see what's happening? There's something in their life that precludes them from actually seeing who Jesus is. Carbon monoxide is a little bit like this. Carbon monoxide is, here's your PSA for the morning, one of the most dangerous gases that we know because it is the most hard to detect. In other words, it's colorless, can't see it, and it's odorless. And the more that it builds up in your home, the more it puts you to sleep. And the more drowsy that you get, the harder it is to actually recognize it. It's sinister that way. So they say every home should have a carbon monoxide detector because you don't and you're unable to recognize it. Pride is the carbon monoxide of our hearts. In fact, the more there is of it, the harder there is to recognize it. It is colorless. You can't see it. It is odorless to yourself. You can't smell it. By the way, to everybody else it stinks. But to you it doesn't. And the more that you have, the more difficult it is. See, there's a blindness that can come towards the things of God because of pride, and Jesus is trying to force that issue. He's saying, I can make blind men see. I'm trying to work on your hearts. 2 Corinthians 4:3-4 says this, if our good news of Jesus is veiled, it's veiled to those who are perishing. For their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel or the good news of the glory of Christ. He's saying, if you really want to know, there's an enemy at work that has caused people to not see. There's actively somebody trying to blind you from seeing the truth. Jesus, talking about Pharisees, this group of people, said this in Matthew 15:4. He says, let them alone. They are blind guides. And if the blind lead the blind, both fall into a pit. Like, that makes sense, right? Blind people cannot help blind people. Talking further about this, the author of the book of Romans says this, professing to be wise, they became fools. So we have a prideful people, and they're going, hey, it ought to be obvious, but it's not. In fact, the more obvious God gets, the more offended they get. That's how you know it's pride. You have a friend like that? I'm sure you do. Some of you have a friend, they're doing something, they're headed somewhere in their life, they've told you there's a pattern in their life, and you're going, that is not a good pattern. That leads off a cliff. And so you try to make sense to them. You might talk to them. You might drop some subtle hints. That's not working at all. So finally you sit down over coffee or you sit down while you're driving and you say, I really need to talk to you. I am concerned about a pattern of behavior, or I don't think this is leading the right way. I don't think this is going the right way. And the more clear you are, the more offended they get. You know, the same thing is true with God. That the more clear he is with you and the more clear he is with me, do you know what happens if we are prideful? We get offended. They go, how could you? And we see that in their life. Passing through a portion of the West in 1858, one lieutenant wrote this about the area that they drove through. He said this region we last explored is, of course, altogether valueless. It can be approached only from the south, and after entering it, there is nothing to do but leave. Ours has been the first and doubtless will be the last party of Americans to visit this profitless locality. It seems intended that the Colorado River along the greater portion of its lonely and majestic way shall be forever unvisited and undisturbed. You know what he's talking about? The Grand Canyon. Nobody visits there, ever. You're like, my goodness, he was totally wrong. Yeah, pretty obvious, and yet he missed it. Listen, it's entirely possible to be 100% sure in your heart. To be, I know I'm right. And Jesus goes, it's entirely possible that you might be blind. He says this, for judgment I came into the world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. What's Jesus saying? He's saying, listen, I am a dividing factor. I've come to solve two issues, to make all things new again. And one day, someday, all sight and all issues and all physical ailments will be made new. And that's a symbol of what he did with that man. He's like, but there's another problem. I came to solve the issue of pride, and I will either deal with that pride or you can fight me on it. There's no in between. And they go, are we blind too? And he goes, you know what? If you were blind and you really couldn't see, we wouldn't be having this discussion, but because you claim to be the wise ones and know all this stuff, the truth is you're guilty of being blind. Which is ironic because the conversation starts with who sinned, this blind guy or his parents? And Jesus goes, you want to know what kind of blindness is caused by sin? It's not physical blindness. It's spiritual blindness. Sin blinds us spiritually. A man named Henry Drummond said this, Christ, Jesus, never failed to distinguish between doubt and unbelief. Doubt is can't believe. Unbelief is won't believe. Doubt is honesty. Unbelief is obstinacy. Doubt is looking for light. Unbelief is content with darkness. Man, that's this passage. In fact, more striking than the belief of one man is the unbelief of 70 or 10, somewhere between there. The neighbors are like, how? I think at some point we have to ask the question, am I blind too? Have I really seen Jesus? Have I been listening to what he's been saying to me? Has he been coming to approach my darkness? Has he been coming to fix it? Is he going, here's why I came? And I'm going, no, you don't see what's going on. You don't know. And he's like, I'm here to fix it. I'm here to address it. I want to, and I can. And we're like, nope. We get offended. We push him away. We say, that can't be it. There's got to be another way. And he's like, the way is that you come to me, confess your pride, and I change you. And you're going, I don't know. That's a lot. There's got to be another way. And he's like, no, this is the obvious issue. It's obvious in your life, and it's obvious to me, and I'm here to do something about it. I'm not scared of it. Are you? See, at some point, we have to get honest with ourselves and ask that question. That's the miracle of blind eyes. It's the metaphor of a blind heart. And then lastly, John shows us here the man. And you say, well, what do we see with the man? Well, we see that in this man, Jesus heals both. Completely physically and spiritually transformed. They kick this guy out. And for the second time, I love it, for the second time, Jesus goes and finds him. This man never sought Jesus. This man never was like, where is that guy? This guy's not going, Jesus, would you heal me? This is Jesus having compassion on the man's physical and spiritual condition. And in the same way that he sought him out to heal him physically, Jesus seeks him out to heal him spiritually. Jesus finds the guy and he says, do you believe in the Messiah? Hey, blind guy who can now see, do you believe in the Messiah? And he answered, who is he? I love that. He doesn't even fake it, right? The Pharisees, the teachers of the law, we know who the Messiah is. He's clearly not this guy. Look at the humility of the blind guy. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Who is he? And Jesus says, you've seen him. I mean, you were blind, and then he healed you. And by the way, he who is speaking to you is him. That's who he is. It's me. I'm talking to you. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. This man was transformed inwardly and out. Notice, he did not believe because he was healed. That's not the only reason. He's actually responding to what he's hearing now from Jesus. And he's doing the math and putting it together. This isn't like he touched my eyes and now he touched my eyes. Also, who are you? Okay, I believe in that. Both his heart and his eyes are healed. This is a picture of what happens when you're transformed by Jesus. Complete picture. Inwardly, outwardly. I mean, one day, someday, everybody ends up like this guy. Physical issues, heart issues, both the problem of pain and the problem of pride are solved by Jesus. That's him. You realize that the only explanation for followers of Jesus is Jesus? That's the only one you can give. At one point in time, the man goes, I don't know. All I know is that I was blind and I was see. That's pretty much the story of most everyone who's ever followed Jesus. Jesus is the only logical explanation for that. In college, we had a friend who had a car that was pretty dirty, and he would drive it around, and it would just, this isn't the car, I just brought a picture of a dirty car, and this is the better of the dirty car pictures on the internet, by the way. There's some pretty gross ones out there, but his was like this. He just kind of kept it on the left there. It was a mess, and if you rode anywhere with him, you're like, oh man, he had to like take a snow shovel and like move everything to the back kind of thing, or like just you open the door and it falls out on the ground, and he's just kind of known for that. And so if you ever needed to go anywhere with him, we'd just be like, I'll drive, you know. Are you sure? I'm sure. Got it? I can move some stuff around. I love that. I can move some stuff around, like all of the stuff, right? Like, okay. So he, you know, but one day we realized that his car was spotless. And we're like, are you all right, man? Like, what is going on? You open the door and this waft of like, is that vanilla and leather? You don't even have leather. What is this, right? Like, what is going on? And it's like, it's everything inside slick. You know what I mean? It's like that like wet look in cars where it's like you touch the dash and it goes, you know, like all that. You get in and you're like, this is great. And he's like, yeah, it's great. And you're like, what happened to you? Did you find God, right? It wasn't God. Do you know what it was? You guys know what it was. It was a girl. That's right. I don't know if he'd been living under a log, but I don't know. He turned 19 and he's like, he's like, he found a girl. And he had to go on a date. And thank the Lord, I don't know if it was him or someone in his life pulled him aside and said, I need to be really offensive to you right now. You cannot take this girl in this car, right? So he cleaned his car out. The only explanation is that, listen, that's what happens in your life with Jesus. John is going, the only explanation for the problem of pride and the problem of pain is Jesus. Followers of him stand one day, someday, at the end of eternity and going, along the way, Jesus is the only answer that explains who I am. Now, this doesn't happen immediate with this guy. It's gradual. In fact, you can see this. Look, verse 11, the man called Jesus. That's what the man said about Jesus. He's the man. He's a man. This is what he says next, this blind guy. He's a prophet. He moves from man to prophet. Notice next, he goes like this. I don't know. All I know is that I was blind and now I see. And he keeps going. He's like, oh, he's from God. And then lastly, at the end, we see this. He says, Lord, I believe. At some point, as the story goes, he's like, I don't know, he's a man, and he's actually moving. Now, that's the same progress that happens as God begins to move and touch your life and address your pain and address your pride. You're like, I don't know, he's a man. I don't know, maybe he's a prophet. I don't know, all I know is that things are changing in my life. Well, he was a really good dude. He's from God. And eventually, at some point along the way, God's heart and his desire is that you would uncover who Jesus is. You see, that's really how you know you're starting to investigate Christ. You say, well, how do I know when God's at work in my life? It's when your life moves from the question of how. Everybody else but this man, they're all asking how. How did he do it? Tell me how he did it. They're trying to figure it out. How did he do it? 6 times. You know the only question this man asks? Who? Same letters, just mix them together. When your life moves from how to who, you're getting somewhere with God. It doesn't mean how's not important. It just means at some point you're like, who are you, Jesus? And he worships. He worships. He falls at his feet, says, that's who you are. Talking about this in his own life, a scientist named Francis Collins, he actually helped untangle the human genome. He wrote this in his book, The Language of God. He came to know Jesus. He says this, for me, the experience of sequencing the human genome was both a stunning scientific achievement and an occasion of worship. What's he saying? He's at some point along the way, I went from how does this work? And how is this put together? And how does this all function? To who in the world did this? And when he began asking who, he began exploring Christ. And it changed his life. I think that's true for followers of God. If you were to look back in your life, if you are a follower of Jesus, at some point it went from how to how, and those questions are good to explore. At some point, Jesus confronted your pride or your pain. And you go, who? Who is that? And the good news is this, that Jesus still opens eyes and hearts. He still does. That's what he's in the business of. That's his job. And that's what he wants to do today. And so as we wrap this up, I would just say this. Some of you might be here and you might be missing the miracle. And I don't mean that God wants to work a miracle in your life and whatever it is you need fixed, he's going to wave his magic wands and fix. I'm talking about Jesus and what he did for you on the cross. You could be missing what that means. To be honest, there are churches where there is no room for change or changed lives because all it is just pride. There are hearts which there's no room for change. I wonder, have you constructed a system in your life that keeps you from seeing Jesus? Maybe it's a system of approval. Approval of others, approval of yourself, laws, extra things you put on. And Jesus is like, I'm here, I want to see you, and you keep getting offended by it. For some of you, you might be sitting here and going, I have nothing to say. You're a pastor. Someone talks to you about Jesus. You've got all the answers about how, and there's 100 questions. Listen, can I just encourage you for a second? If you know Jesus, if you've been changed by him, you have something to say. At the very least, you go, all I know is I was one way, and now I'm not that way anymore. Because Jesus touched my life. And some of you, you're sitting face to face with Jesus, and you're going, who? And he's going, it's the one you're talking to. It's the one that you're seeing right now. And the invitation for you might be to see him for the first time in your life and respond. I'm going to pray for us and ask that God addresses both our pain and our pride this morning. Father, we want to be people who don't just say that we see God, no one else sees God, we know what's up. We just want to be people who simply say that we've seen you in our life. We've seen you at work, and we know that's true because we were one way, and now we're not that way. Lord, would you make us this morning into people who say with one voice that we don't know all the answers, but we know Jesus because of how you're at work in us. Lord, make us into people who are not keepers of our truth, but those who love your truth. Lord, show us where our hearts have been hard. Lord, for the person who's here and they're in pain, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and they think that you're blind to them, or would you just show them this morning that you're not? This is exactly why you came. Lord, we love you and we trust you. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen.